Welcome to the session.
Well, thank you so much and welcome to all of you listening to this session. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers here today, people who have been engaged in this area for many years and are world leaders, world thought leaders on the topic of climate change from its various perspectives. As I think everyone knows, the Conference of the Parties, COP26, is coming up, and we know that we're not acting quickly enough on climate change. Climate change has a range of impacts on human health. Indeed, it's been called the greatest threat to human health this century by the World Health Organization, and it will have impacts on human health through a range of different pathways: effects of extreme heat, extreme events like floods and storms, vector-borne, waterborne, foodborne diseases, increasing natural disasters, and a range of other impacts as well, not just on physical health, but also on mental health. But we're not going to focus today on those many threats to human health. We're going to focus rather on what we can do about it. What kind of actions can society take in order to rapidly decarbonize the economy, to move towards a net zero economy by mid-century at the latest, in order to reduce the risks of dangerous climate change as much as we can. We know that action is not happening at the speed that's really necessary. We're still emitting far too much greenhouse gases, and there's a real danger that the 1.5 degree centigrade target, which is the optimal target under the Paris Agreement, will not be reached. And even to keep well under 2 degrees could be quite a struggle. So it's really important that we motivate rapid action. And one way of doing that, of course, is by emphasizing the health benefits of action, not just the benefits of averting dangerous climate change, but also the near-term benefits from reduced air pollution, for example, or healthier diets, more physical activity, more livable and healthy cities, for example. So to set the scene, I'm going to call on the first speaker, someone who's very well known for his pioneering work. He's a director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Johan Rockström has really become internationally recognized because of his work on global sustainability issues. And he was amongst the pioneers of the concept of planetary boundaries. He was very much one of the thought leaders of this whole concept, which really can help to guide us in this current era of rapid global change. He has many other roles. I won't read them all out, but he's a very important actor in the World Economic Forum, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and of course the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change. He chairs the advisory board for the EAT Foundation and has been appointed as chair of the Earth Commission. So Johan, over to you to really try to summarize the many threats that we're facing at present.
Thanks, Andy, and really important to be with you at this decisive moment, just a few weeks before Glasgow, and when we have a decade ahead when we need to not only cut global emissions by half, but actually turn around basically the whole trajectory back into a healthy, planetary, and world development within a safe operating space. What I'll do in the next 10 minutes is just to give you a little summary of the integrated diagnostic, but also point ahead of why a Pathfinder transition on solutions is absolutely crucial and can give a lot of promise and delivery. Well, obviously, the starting point in any kind of discussion around where we're heading, one that should just kind of take stock of the advancements in science over the past 30 years. I mean, the first one is the evidence of the great acceleration and all the exponential pressure curves on the planet, published the first time in 2007 by another kind of Pathfinder mission by the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. That led to the conclusion that we've entered the whole new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. We're now the primary driving force of change on the entire planet. So planetary health is a real agenda for human well-being. This is now supported also by the advancements even in the IPCC, the very baseline of evidence we're sitting on. This is the famous red embers diagrams of risk over the past 4 IPCC assessment reports from 2001 until today. Dark red is high risk of causing in this case, large-scale discontinuities, basically irreversible commitment. You see how just 19 years ago, we thought that the risk was not something to really have to consider until we reach global mean temperature rise of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. That's the red point to the furthest right. Today, the risk levels is coming down in red already at 2 degrees Celsius. So the more we learn about our pressures on the Earth system and the function of the Earth system, the higher is the risk at temperatures that we're approaching very rapidly. We're on a journey of 2.7 at this century, as you know. We're learning a lot about nonlinear dynamics and that we have multiple stable states in global commons of the Earth system. So today we can say that we are at risk of a destabilizing system, not because of just the pressure, but also because of the risk of crossing tipping points where systems can go from one stability domain, like a rainforest, into an irreversible journey towards another state, a savanna, which would undermine human health and stability for societies. This was first mapped in 2008, so roughly at the same time as a systemic analysis of hockey stick patterns. We had the first to the left here, tipping elements map. This was updated just last year to the right here, showing that 9 out of the known 15 large global commons that regulates the state of the climate system are showing signs of instability. The IPCC actually captures 5 of these: the Arctic sea ice, Greenland ice sheet, the Atlantic overturning of heat, the Amazon rainforest, and West Antarctic ice shelf, concluding that it's still low probability, high impact, but that we cannot rule out destabilizing these systems. That's why, which Andy referred to, the Earth Commission has been established to explore our path to the future. How can we ensure a future where we, at this point where we're largely at the edge of the Holocene stability, the latest interglacial state we've been in since the last ice age, we're now in the Anthropocene. Are we able to transition and become stewards with solutions, equitable solutions, to stay within a safe and just planet? Or are we at risk of irreversibly pushing ourselves towards less and less livable conditions on Earth? That's the juncture we've reached. That's why science has brought forward the planetary boundary framework as a guiding principle. That's why I would argue we have more scientific support than ever now that we're standing, for example, on the 6th assessment of the IPCC report. It's quite significant that the IPCC not only concludes that we have more and more impacts already at 1.1 degrees Celsius in both severity and frequency, like heat waves and extreme rainfall events and drought, but also that we reached the warmest temperature on Earth since the last 100,000 years, already at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. In fact, our latest climate modeling shows that we've never passed 2 degrees over the past 3 million years. So this is the entire quaternary, the first time a physically based climate model, the Climate X model here at the Potsdam Institute, is run and reproduced ice cycles, glacial, interglacials over the past quaternary. And this is just a humble recognition of how important a transition back into a planetary health future is for our chances of having a good, thriving, and equitable future for humanity. And it's not only about decarbonizing the energy system. The IPCC concludes that 56% of our emission of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning have been taken up by resilient ecosystems on land and in ocean. And actually, all the IPCC modeling runs into the future that gives us the 400 gigatons of remaining carbon budget, the 9.5 years of emissions at current rate, that we can allow ourselves to deliver on the Paris 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, relies on nature being able to continue to deliver that global free service. So this is quite an optimistic conclusion, to say the least, but it also proves that anything around a Pathfinder future relies on us being able to take an integrated approach on both decarbonizing the energy system, but also addressing human health and biosphere health. We actually published in PNAS just a few weeks back a very simple assessment showing that if we hadn't had a healthy biosphere, we would already have lost the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. So without carbon sinks in nature, we would already have been past the limits. So planetary health is fundamental. We did a Pathfinder attempt with the Eat Lancet Commission report just 2 years back, trying for the first time to scientifically define a healthy diet from sustainable food systems as a universal framework to guide one of these pathway transitions. We show that the food system is responsible for essentially large part of the transition of the planetary boundaries. Globally, 4 of the 9 boundaries are transgressed. Here you see the food system share of this, significantly causing 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, the largest cause of biodiversity loss, the largest share of land system expansion, the single largest consumer of fresh water, and the #1 cause of overloading the biosphere with nitrogen and phosphorus. This then led to an exploration of Pathfinder solutions. I mean, solutions that are available in terms of reducing food waste, in terms of investing in sustainable crop rotation, in terms of conservation tillage systems, in terms of moving towards a more flexitarian diet, where reducing animal proteins in favor of plant-based proteins and kilocalories, which would give a win-win, both in terms of improved health for humans, but also in terms of planetary health. What this resulted in a number of scenario runs, and this is a bit of a messy graph, but on the x-axis here, you have all the planetary boundaries, and on the y kind of columns, you have different options. And the only one you have to look at is the bottom line, where sustainable productivity, cutting food waste by half, and adopting a healthy planetary diet, which is a flexitarian diet aligned with the best health science, would give us, as you see, a chance of returning back into a safe operating space on a healthy planet, which is symbolized here by the green and yellow colors. And if we continue as today, we end up in the red right across, which is basically eating as today without sustainable production systems with full 30% food waste. So food on its own can tip the balance whether we are inside or outside of a planet that remains in a Holocene-like state in the future. That in itself is quite promising in terms of what we can accomplish with the food system transition, but also a dire challenge. This has been supported later by additional studies showing that under current production systems for food, we can actually only feed 3.4 billion people. I mean, if we would think only of the planet, but if we think only of humans, we would basically continue risking the stability of the planet on the short term while feeding 7.8 going to 10 billion people. But we also show in this research that if you do a systemic analysis, you can find solutions in current existing practices that actually can align with circularity of nutrients, water productivity, net carbon sinks, shifting farming systems from source to sink across the entire world, thereby feeding potentially up to 10 billion people within planetary boundaries. So it's not as if it's a lost cause. On the contrary, Pathfinder solutions can provide evidence and therefore also confidence that we're able to practice and invest ourselves towards a future which I would define as achieving the sustainable development goals within a stable and resilient Earth system. And to me, that's why the World Health Summit and the discussions on the Pathfinder transitions are so incredibly important. So back to you, Andy, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Johan, for giving us such a brilliant start to this session. And I'm sure that will stimulate quite a lot of questions. I'm going to give people a moment or two to reflect. But while they're reflecting, I just wanted to ask you myself, you mentioned the importance of tipping points, these non-linear changes that can suddenly throw the Earth system into a completely different state. And can I ask you, of the tipping points that you've outlined, which are the ones that really concern you the most, where you think either we're closest to the tipping point or they'll have the most serious implications for human society?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think that's a really good but also difficult question to answer, because we have not only multiple tipping points, but also we have more and more evidence, even though that is in the frontier of science, so not fully established, that these are interconnected, which means that one can impact the other. But I think what concerns me most today is the indications we have of coming much too close for comfort to a tipping point in the rainforest systems in the Amazon. We know from the published research that the Brazilian part of the Amazon has already gone from carbon sink to carbon source. We also know that losing the world's richest habitat would be a tremendous impact on biodiversity, on carbon sinks, on moisture feedback and freshwater supply, and climate impacts. So that's perhaps one candidate, number one. The second one is obviously the fact that we've pushed tropical coral reef systems very close to irreversible loss. And then finally, I would say that, you know, it's really a concern what's happening with the overturning of heat in the ocean and the whole ocean stability. Not that we have evidence that we are close to a kind of the edge of irreversible changes, but we have worrying signs of a slowdown, 15% slowdown of the Atlantic overturning circulation. We know that this is linked to the monsoon stability over both South America and West Africa. So we have to keep a very close eye and see the ocean as one of the really, let's say, concerning systems that may or may not tip, but we're showing more and more evidence of a worrying trajectory.
Many thanks, Johan. And these are really very powerful and sobering words. And I think the tipping points you've mentioned, of course, all have direct and indirect implications for human health, negative implications, of course. And the smoke, for example, from the Amazonian fires is causing impacts on human health right now, as well as leading to devastating biodiversity loss. And of course, you know, over 2 billion people depend on the oceans for essential micronutrients and proteins. So if the oceans stop producing some of the fish and the other products from the oceans that sustain communities, that will have major implications for human health. So thanks very much. Now, do we have any other, no other questions at the moment? So I think, therefore, we should probably, I know you've got to leave very shortly anyway, Johan, we should probably let you go and pass on to the next speaker. Lena Srivastava, who is currently Deputy Director of the IASA, the Internet. Oops, sorry, my screen is giving some trouble. Let me just get that back up. So she's currently Deputy Director General at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. She was the Vice Chancellor of the Terry School of Advanced Studies in New Delhi, which is a very famous interdisciplinary higher education institution focused on sustainable development. And she's worked for over 3 decades on research in the areas of energy, environment, and climate change policies at Terry. She's been coordinating lead author of Working Group 3 of the 3rd assessment report of the IPCC. So she's very much focused on potential solutions on mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, and has been involved in a whole range of other IPCC activities, and of course has been a member of the expert committee devoted to framing India's energy policies. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome her to talk to us today from her perspective, from the immense amount of work that's going on in IASA. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for having me here to speak on this very important subject on the Pathfinders Commission. As all of us have just heard from Johan, and it's a very difficult act to follow, Johan. I do not have any slides to share with you, but I hope to be able to just walk you through some of my thinking on this subject. So as I was saying, as we've just heard, the world is facing a very complex situation as described by Johan. Climate change is hugely adversely affecting human beings and enhancing our vulnerabilities. And I think these vulnerabilities and impacts are visible to us all around. We have seen this in the form of the forest fires. We have seen this in the form of various monsoon events and cyclones and so on. So today, I think when we are speaking about climate change, we have to speak to mitigation options, which are the drivers of climate change, adaptation actions to minimize the consequences of climate change, as well as resilience building the resilience of human beings, all in the same breath. Earlier on, as Johan was pointing in the case of the burning embers figure, we used to speak about more time that was available to us. But today, all of the actions that we can possibly take on climate change have to come together and have to come together with a number of other actions on other issues that he rightly pointed out. And the magnitude of the actions that we require on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience all depend on how strongly we act on the other. So the interconnectedness of all these actions, I think, is critically important. For resilience building, we are fortunate to have a fairly comprehensive roadmap. All of you may have heard about it. Agenda 2030, which delineates 17 sustainable development goals that hope to address the compounding crisis of food, water, air pollution, biodiversity loss, etc., as well as the social underpinnings of a resilient population relating to things like poverty, jobs, nutrition, health, etc. Action on any or each of these 17 goals has the potential for creating synergies as well as trade-offs with other goals. So once again, very complicated, integrated, and interlinked. We like synergies, but we do not like trade-offs and do not have the time for trade-offs. Agenda 2030 calls upon us to look upon SDGs as integrated and indivisible, but we are not organized to do so. We function in silos, and these trade-offs that we are speaking about across SDGs actually also prevail between climate mitigation and climate adaptation actions. So finding solutions that are coherent to climate mitigation, to climate adaptation, and to resilience building through the SDGs is an extremely complex task. And then, of course, we have the rapid degradation of our ecosystems and biodiversity, which Johan already addressed. To me, COVID-19 is a case in point, a zoonotic disease that has held the mirror up to the world on our complete unpreparedness to deal with unanticipated crises and our limited understanding of the interconnected issues which have resulted in several adverse effects. The developmental progress that we made over the last several decades is being wiped out, enhancing human vulnerabilities. Adverse economic impacts on public finances has resulted in growing national debt, and environmental issues are being put on the back burner, which is again auguring not well for all the threats that we are talking about. Human health and health systems too, unfortunately, are being battered by these emerging crises, despite all the advances in medicine. Lifestyle diseases are competing with these zoonotic diseases. Stress disorders are increasing manifold. There are a plethora of diseases caused by resource degradation, and of course, a mental health epidemic, which is being caused by a highly insecure planet. So all of these challenges are coming together and clashing. But the elephant in the room, which is growing ever larger day by day, is inequality. SDG 10, Sustainable Development Goal number 10, on inequalities is the core of Agenda 2030, which promises to leave no one behind. But the poorer and more marginalized you are, the greater your vulnerability. And almost every action we are taking today to mitigate or to mitigate to the effects of climate change is threatening to exacerbate inequality. It's a point that I will come back to in a little while. Broadly speaking, I think we can say that mitigation and adaptation actions at a macro level will willy-nilly either improve human health or hold the potential to improve human health. The choices we make then and how explicitly we cater to the very vulnerable populations in planet Earth will determine if human health will improve at a granular level too, in all countries, age groups, ethnicities, income classes, etc. So thus far, we have a very gloomy picture ahead of us, but there is the other side of the coin, which is always the case. The same gloomy situation also holds promise, again, depending on how we move forward with it. COVID-19, coming back to that, has demonstrated that when faced with a crisis, human society can rise up to the challenge. Governments can take decisive measures. Industry can design innovative solutions, opening up alternative pathways for development, and civil society can make sustainable lifestyle choices. We also know the climate mitigation actions, and we have the technologies to be able to mitigate the challenge. And mitigate we must, because the 1.5 degrees Celsius report of IPCC has shown us that every 0.1 degree or 0.5 degrees of climate change that you can avoid has a huge impact on our vulnerabilities and risks. But the problem is that we haven't been able to convince decision makers or even society at large on the course of action which is needed. Today, governments are convinced on the need to address climate change, to build adaptive capacity, and to build resilience. They're also convinced about the interlinkages of the global challenges. But we as scientists continue to speak in fragmented voices, pulling in diverse directions without the vision of a coherent pathway that is implementable. We need to step up and provide help to the decision makers. So it is no wonder that we are lagging dangerously behind the goals we have set ourselves. I do not want to be only negative about the scientists. It's because of science that we are where we are in our understanding and in our recognition of the pathways that are available to us. But we need to move forward a lot more and much faster because we are running out of time. Our need now is to harness the capabilities that we have already developed: artificial intelligence, machine learning, digitization, earth observation, and many others. And on the softer side, citizen science, interdisciplinarity, multi-stakeholder partnerships, etc., in a coherent manner to design systemic solutions, which Johan referred to, avoid pitfalls and failed experiments, and show the way to a new green, sustainable, and equitable world. For you, the medical community, I think this translates into a much deeper and aggressive engagement with all other scientific communities to ensure that the health outcomes of alternative development pathways do not overwhelm you. You have to embrace the path of precaution and become part of the prevention. IASA, the institute I'm currently working in, has been engaged for half a century now on building models that would deconstruct complex challenges, develop new future scenarios, and provide alternative pathways to achieve the same. We have increasingly been focusing on representing the more complex interactions I alluded to earlier in an effort to unravel the same and enable the decision makers a peek into the implications of interventionist actions on a range of outcomes. We are also trying to build a more robust representation of issues of equity and justice. The new construct of a sustainable society cannot repeat the colossal mistakes of the past. However, we recognize that not everything can be modeled, as we still do not have adequate data and analysis on every subcomponent of this very complex planetary system that we have. More importantly, models can provide directions, not solutions. Gaps in the scientific work that we have need to be filled with the knowledge of practitioners and other disciplinary experts, such as all of you on this particular summit. Very briefly, moving to the subject more specifically of climate change and health, I think this came into focus by the climate scientists in an effort to bolster the arguments for rapid climate action and recognizing health as a key driver for socio-political change. Some health outcomes are direct, example, reduced heat exposures and health, as Andy pointed towards, whereas others play themselves out indirectly via reduced air pollution from climate mitigation actions or improved health infrastructures because of better access to energy, for example, in the developing world. But there exists a wide distance between scientific research and practice. As such, it is only more recently that attention of climate researchers has also focused on the negative social outcomes of climate actions, possibly a key factor in the resistance to action. The Pathfinder Initiative had set itself a goal of looking for real-life examples of health co-benefits or collateral damages based on peer-reviewed literature. I would limit myself to saying that either this kind of research is extremely limited, or there is little support for such research, and we have still a pretty long way to go. A couple of quick examples from a review paper on the social impacts of climate mitigation highlight the fact that climate mitigation policies realize the potential to achieve positive health impacts, not very often or not always. There are several examples given in this particular reference paper, which is published in Climate Policy, but there are many other papers as well that highlight the fact that if we do not prepare well for climate mitigation actions, we could actually have negative health consequences. If, for example, when we talk about insulation improvements and we do not invest sufficiently in building the capacities of workers, this can actually reduce airflows and damage indoor air quality, outweighing the positive health effects of improved indoor living comfort. The mental and physical health of communities in and around forest areas that would be subject of mitigation actions could also be negatively affected if the forest protection initiatives are not accompanied by improved access to health services. So there are a number of places where we can go wrong, which we need to be cognizant about. I do not want to give more examples, but suffice it to say that there are several that exist. I would argue that most of these interventions that we design still are siloed in nature, and in the context of inequality, are merely justifying mitigation actions targeting the poor. We need to be much bolder to be able to not just strive towards maintaining the inequality that we have, but be able to alleviate it. The challenge for us remains, do we prioritize those actions that have big mitigation impact, big inequality reduction impacts on a range of development benefits? Or do we try to find a balance between these? How do we weight these considerations? There are many unanswered questions that still remain, but we need to find answers differently from the way we did in the past, and collectively, all of us together. This plane towards sustainability is a plane that has to fly while it is being built. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Andy.
Thank you so much, Lena, for a wonderful talk, I think, which really encapsulates many of the challenges, but also the opportunities that are facing us. I think now, because we've got several speakers coming, we're going to go straight on to the next speaker, that's myself, and then we're going to take questions at the end. So I'm going to say a few words about the Pathfinder Initiative itself, to give you a bit more background, and to say why I think it's important, and how it can help to illuminate, at least to some degree, some of the challenges and opportunities facing us at the moment. Hopefully you can see my slides now. I would imagine that you can. The slide really just summarizes some of the data that Johan has already talked about, and really emphasizes the need for urgent and ambitious action. You can see that current policies take us somewhere around 3 degrees, perhaps a little bit below 3 degrees. And you can see the level of cuts that are needed to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And that's a prospect which, as I've said, is sadly rather vanishing at the moment, although of course we have to keep on demanding those deep cuts to achieve that goal. So we have to ensure, as Lena has very compellingly told us, that these cuts are compatible with healthier, more equitable societies, and that the mitigation health nexus, cutting emissions and improving health, could be part of a societal transformation for a just and healthy transition towards a net zero economy by mid-century at the latest. And this slide just summarizes some of the concrete steps that need to be taken for a 1.5 degrees centigrade world. And you can see that they're very profound steps indeed. Renovating 3 to 5% of buildings a year, retrofitting buildings with better insulation and ventilation, ensuring that new buildings have zero emissions from 2020, that's already from last year, best practice in agriculture and food systems, which Johan has talked about, and zero deforestation, ensuring that industry is low carbon, that fossil fuel cars are rapidly phased out, that there are no coal power plants, and a vision also for aviation and shipping. So these are all in their own right. Each one of them is a very big ask indeed, and we need to do all of them simultaneously. So how can improved health, help motivate more deeper and more profound action to decarbonize the economy? Well, one obvious answer is that there are many lives that can be saved, many premature deaths that can be averted by these actions. So these are over and above the premature deaths that can be averted as a result of reducing the risks of dangerous climate change. So, for example, as we decarbonize the energy sector, we can reduce air pollution related deaths. About 7 million, we're told, a year by WHO from household and ambient air pollution. Estimate a couple of years ago suggested 3.6 million ambient air pollution deaths from fossil fuel burning, something of that order. So as we phase out fossil fuels, we can capitalize on these near-term benefits to human health, reducing heart attacks, strokes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, some cases of lung cancer and other diseases as well. Transportation system also fosters ill health, not just through air pollution, but also through supporting sedentarism, physical inactivity, which has been assessed as being responsible for perhaps 5 million premature deaths a year, conditions like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and others related to physical inactivity, and over 1 million deaths from road traffic crashes. And food and land use, as we've heard so vividly from Johan, is a major driver of ill health through unhealthy diets, inadequate fruit and vegetable intakes, excessive consumption of red meat. So there's a lot that can be done in the near term to really redirect society towards a more sustainable future, but also a healthier one. So the Pathfinder Initiative, very briefly, funded by the Wellcome Trust and the Oak Foundation, aims to show how decarbonisation strategies in different sectors affect health and greenhouse gas emissions in practice. As Lena's mentioned, we know quite a lot from modelling that there are big benefits potentially, but we still don't know quite how, the extent to which we can achieve those benefits in practice, nor do we understand how to accelerate the implementation of these policies. So we're trying to address these complex issues of how can we implement and in the end finance well-designed policies and technologies that can yield multiple benefits for people and the planet. And that involves a couple of activities. First of all, synthesizing case studies, real life examples of what happens when you implement these changes, and also systematically reviewing the existing literature by doing an umbrella review of all the previous existing reviews that have touched on these topics. And finally, there's an element of a strand of work on the political economy and financing that I won't mention today. So let me give you a few brief examples of the kind of studies that we're coming across. First of all, this study looks at the scale up of renewable energy in the USA, and you can see how wind and solar generation on the continental USA has increased quite dramatically, really, over an 8-year period, 2007 and 2015. This is a paper written in 2017. You can see how utility wind generation has gone up, utility photovoltaics, and to a lesser extent, distributed photovoltaics on private properties or other single buildings. And you can see that there's really been quite an impressive scale up. And it's been estimated that the air quality benefits of this are somewhere between about 30 and over 100 billion US dollars, mostly related to putting a value on the avoided premature deaths. There are some uncertainties around these deaths because some of these emissions, like fine particles, are not measured routinely as they're emitted from power stations. They have to be estimated. But it is pretty clear that very large amounts of CO2 have been avoided, about 146 million tons of carbon dioxide averted by 2015 from the scale up of renewable energy. And you can see then how the scale up of renewable energy around the world, particularly where it displaces coal, which of course is the most polluting source of fossil fuel energy, can have really quite substantial effects on health. And these in turn, when you value them using economic criteria, can have a major benefit. So the next study is a study of moving from coal to natural gas heating in rural China to large rural districts. Much of the urban China, of course, already has natural gas, but many rural areas do not. And so this looks at the potential benefits of moving towards natural gas in these rural areas, two quite large districts of populations of over 500,000 people. And what they found was big reductions in PM 2.5, that's the fine particles, about 1/40th the size of a human hair that penetrate deep into the lungs, of course, and cause a lot of the heart disease and other health risks. Big reductions in carbon dioxide in the two regions, and in methane and in global warming potential overall. So big benefits to the climate, but also annual premature deaths avoided, around about 3,000 each in the two districts. So you can imagine scaling that up to rural China would really have tremendously large health and climate benefits from such a policy. Of course, natural gas is not fossil fuel free, it's a fossil fuel, so it's really a temporary solution, but it is a step on the pathway towards a clean net zero economy. Active transport, this is an example of the effect of New Zealand's model communities program on active and motorized trips in two locations in the towns of Hastings and New Plymouth. And this is a program to combining central and local government funding to promote walking and cycling, which focused on infrastructure investment, as well as education and promotion of active travel. And you can see that there was quite a dramatic increase in active trips, a smaller decrease in motorized trips, probably as one would expect, because many of these trips wouldn't necessarily be done by car, but a small proportion of them are. And that results in some benefits in terms of local air pollution, but also greenhouse gas emissions. Relatively small benefits, but if you could imagine this kind of intervention being scaled up in the cities around the world, the benefits that could accrue could be quite substantial. Indeed, we've done some modelling work in the UK suggesting that if the UK population could walk and cycle like the population of Copenhagen, then you could get very major benefits. The next example, I think, is a very nice one because it takes a different perspective. It looks at the relationship between the destruction of forests and the demand for healthcare. So this is a very interesting paper published a couple of years ago in the PNAS, and it looks at the situation in Indonesian Kalimantan, where there's a lot of illegal logging. And in the communities living next to a protected forest, it was found that one of the major driving forces was the need to raise money to pay for healthcare. So very sensibly, the NGO involved then worked with these communities to say, well, what would it take to stop you illegally deforesting? And one of the big answers that came back, well, provision of affordable healthcare. So that's exactly what this NGO did very successfully. It provided access to community health services, discounts to offset healthcare costs, and it showed that there was a reduction in annual forest loss. This was about 27 square kilometers of forest loss averted compared with synthetic control communities. It also showed that the more engaged the communities were in this program, the more likely they were to use healthcare and to reduce illegal deforestation. And they documented improvements of health as well. Difficult to prove it's purely due to the health service provision because it's not a randomized trial, but nevertheless, it certainly supported the contention that the healthcare system provision was actually having a beneficial impact. So overall then, good evidence of benefits to health and to the environment. Obviously, these forests help to lock in carbon, so they take up carbon, and by reducing deforestation, of course, you reduce the emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere. So how do these different actions compare in terms of their effects on CO2, most important greenhouse gas? The Chinese example of the replacement of coal by natural gas shows really quite large reductions in CO2, about 5 million tons, something of that order in those two areas each. The healthcare conservation, about 590 kilotons, something of that order of carbon dioxide, much less for the cycling and walking example. But again, if one was able to scale this up to larger cities around the world, then there could be quite substantial CO2 benefits as well. So you can see that some of these larger scale activities have in themselves quite a large impact on CO2 emissions. Others would need to be scaled up, they're multiplied by several orders of magnitude in order to have a major benefit. What about food systems? Well, of course, it's difficult to do intervention studies on food systems, but this is a nice couple of studies that we came across in our search. And these were looking at a reduced greenhouse gas emission and nutritionally adequate and affordable 4-week lunch menu optimized for minimum deviation from the current food supply. So this was done in primary schools in Sweden, where they were able to switch the menu to a more environmentally friendly but also healthy dietary options in these primary schools, and they looked at the acceptability and the uptake of these diets and found that they were indeed highly acceptable and they were consumed. There was no increase in food waste, there was no decrease in satisfaction. But what you can see from this very neat experiment is that there was a big reduction between 28 and 40% in the CO2 equivalent emissions per meal. So it does show you that it is possible to change dietary consumption patterns. Perhaps it's easier in young children than adults, I'm not entirely sure. But certainly I'm aware that a number of institutional experiments have looked at the ways of accelerating the change towards more sustainable diets using different works canteens, for example, in order to accelerate that transition. So it does seem to be possible. And then, of course, healthcare. Healthcare itself, we're increasingly aware that healthcare is quite a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. About 4 to 5% on a global scale is related to healthcare. And this example is the example of the English National Health Service, which between 1990 and 2019 decreased its total emissions by about 26%. And that was despite an increase in activity. And so if you look at the emissions per inpatient finished admission episode, those decreased by about 2/3. So this slide shows you the breakdown of these different emissions. And you can see that much of the decrease is because of more efficient delivery of care, reduced anesthetic gases that are very greenhouse active, reduced use of asthma inhalers that are, again, have propellants that are climate active, reduced water and waste use, and reduced building energy, decarbonisation of the energy supply. And you can see that much of the residual is related to the supply chain. So now the priority is to tackle the supply chain emissions by working with pharmaceutical and other companies to incentivize them to reduce the carbon emissions from their supply chains. So that, in conclusion, what I've tried to do is to give you a few examples of how actions in different sectors can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also improve health. And finishing up with the example of the healthcare sector, which is increasingly taking the leadership in terms of decarbonising its own activities, not just working within hospitals and clinics, but also working with the suppliers, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical equipment industry, and others, to incentivize them to reduce the emissions in their supply chains through better contracting, procurement contracts, for example. So there's a lot that can be done, but of course, as Lena has emphasized, a lot of it depends on how it's designed, and whether it's designed to be just and fair, to reduce inequities in health or not. That will be major determinant of the health benefits of these policies. Well, look, I'll stop there, but let me thank the co-chairs of the Pathfinder Initiative, Helen Clark and Joy Fumafi, the core research team, the institutional partners that are summarized on this slide, and the commissioners, some of whom are talking here today. So let me stop my presentation and move then on to the next speaker, who is Tallulah Oni. And Tallulah has a very illustrious career in research. Whoops, excuse me, I just need to escape from my presentation. It doesn't seem to want to do. She completed her medical training at UCL. She's worked very extensively in Africa at the University of Cape Town. She's done a research doctorate in clinical epidemiology. She has a whole range of collaborations across sub-Saharan Africa. She serves on many advisory boards, including that of Future Earth. She's on the editorial board of Lancet Planetary Health. And she's now co-directing the Global Diet and Activity Research Network, the SPACES program, which looks across 7 countries at the interface between diet and activity-related non-communicable diseases, urbanization, and climate change. Over to you, Tallulah.
Thanks, Andy, and previous speakers. It's really, I feel like I'm following very nicely on Andy's talk. Andy, as you were speaking, you helped me delete a whole bunch of different slides, so that's great. So I'll be focusing on the urban side of things, and primarily in the African context, least of all because a lot of the urbanization is ongoing in that region, which I will come to. And as Andy mentioned, we look at generally the interface between urbanization, climate change, and disease, particularly diet and activity related non-communicable diseases. So this is the way I've structured my talk. Some will be familiar with this way of examining a situation. It's a bit like a SWOT analysis. It's called PCO, where you look at the pluses, potentials, concerns, and strategies to overcome any particular issue. It's a really nice way of examining things from all sides. So the plus side of things I won't touch on, because that is essentially what Andy particularly, but the three different speakers have spoken on extensively, which is why this is so important. You know, Andy's expanded on those interlinkages. So I'll focus my talk on the other three. So second is potential. This is where I was initially heading to in terms of why I focus on cities. I would argue that a planetary health focus on cities is critical for at least 5 reasons. Firstly, many parts of the world are rapidly transforming into urban areas. We know that by 2050, almost 70% of the world is projected to be living in urban settings. And this map shows the hourly growth of cities globally, and you can see that this urbanization is not happening equally across the world. So you have anything from 10 people per hour in London, 11 in New York, right through to 56 in Lagos, 75 in Delhi. So you really get a sense of the force of urbanization and how different that is playing out globally. Secondly, we know that urban spaces can amplify or indeed reduce health risks, and Andy's presentation has alluded a lot to that. Thirdly, the greenhouse gas emissions and ecological disruptions that we've been hearing about in previous speakers we know that these expanding cities are a major contributor to these and can contribute to then accelerating climate change and biodiversity loss. Fourthly, we know the cities consume more than half of global energy use. So in terms of use of energy, if we changing the energy use in cities would have a significant impact globally. And lastly, from an impact perspective, cities are disproportionately impacted by climate-induced disruptions. So we see destruction of infrastructure, health-related emergencies, further threatening health and accelerating climate and ecological vulnerability. In the cities where that are urbanizing most rapidly, and these are 2 images from one on the left is from a master plan for Abuja in Nigeria, and the right is from an informal settlement in Cape Town. And I show these to show that cities, particularly across the African region, are dually characterized simultaneously by rapidly growing informal settlements and an increasing investment in new greenfield urban development initiatives. So the reason why this slide is under the potential is that there is a largely untapped opportunity to harness this rapid pace of change for healthy, sustainable initiatives. And perhaps the last and really critical reason why cities in these contexts are so critical is that they're a young population. So when we talk about the African region, we have a median age of 19. We really, in terms of protecting health, need to be focusing disproportionately on keeping people healthy rather than waiting for them to get sick, and certainly not pushing them into ill health. So this represents for me a really strong potential for, I think, when we're thinking about pathways to health, health and climate resilience. So in terms of concern, chief concern here, and just picking up on Lena's point on inequality is the potential for urbanization to perpetuate and accelerate inequality. And this illustration is one way you could see that happening. So when we have these rapidly growing cities pushing the boundaries of human settlements with the potential to disrupt ecology, this can facilitate transmission of infectious diseases as well as increase the risk of emergence of zoonotic diseases, best characterized particularly in context of transmission with dense informal settlements. This then increases vulnerability to disease when we have unhealthy urban environments, inadequate urban infrastructure, and increasing exposure of young people to unhealthy cities. And we see this exemplified by the pandemic, where we see pre-existing comorbidities significantly increasing vulnerability to disease and prognosis of disease. And lastly, impacting inequality with respect to inequitable access to care. So the dimensions really that I speak of inequality are inequality with respect to exposure, with respect to susceptibility, with respect to access to care, and with respect to resilience or consequence of either of being ill or of public health measures. The second concern I want to highlight is twofold. So it's around policy coherence, both at the local level and at the global level. This is an example of a local level interactions and interdependencies. The image is an artist impression of the Eco-Atlantic city in Lagos. So this is being touted as a huge new urban development, as an eco-friendly, smart, climate resilient city that is built on land reclaimed from the Atlantic Ocean, protected by a sea wall, Great Wall of Lagos, it's been touted. But the same wall that will protect residents in this space could worsen the situation for neighboring areas not protected by this wall, which essentially comprises much of Lagos. So these communities already adjacent to this development of this climate resilient city, already at high risk of flooding, are being placed at even higher risks of flooding, with potential impacts for health and health inequality. And secondly, the other unintended consequence of this is that quite a lot of this reclamation privatized public space. So you have a public beach that was a significant space for people to meet in terms of for social activities, for physical activity, as a free public space. And given the rising trend of non-communicable diseases and physical inactivity, these public spaces are really critical. So you also have this downstream ripple effect of the social and health impact of privatizing and reducing access to public space in a city that already has limited access to this. So these kind of interdependencies between the consequences of rapid sea level rise, displacing adjacent communities is I think a clear example of a disconnect at a local spatial scale, and highlights the importance of a more systems approach, even at this local level, to consider equity and to consider who benefits and where the health need lies and where the risks lie. The second part of that policy coherence is a global action. And maybe this is more pertinent for this particular platform. And this is particularly important when the impact of intervention is disconnected both in time and in space. So on the left here, what I show is in February 2021, the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan was announced, and one of the core goals was a 10% reduction in alcohol use in the European Union, because we know alcohol-related harm is a significant public health priority, and actually addressing cancer risk requires addressing alcohol abuse. Also in 2021, February, an open letter was published by the community groups from both Africa and European regions in response to representation of the European Union to South Africa, where there were major alcohol industry front groups and producers from Europe invited, representing the EU, and interfering in the development of alcohol policy solutions by the South African government. So I want to highlight here, I mean, there's a long history of public health interactions and interference in terms of public health policy interference to disrupt and delay and interfere with actions to protect health. And so this is not a climate example, but this is. Late last year, there was a UNEP report by the in October that highlighted the importance of considering the environmental impact of exporting used vehicles to developing world. So if we're talking about improving air quality locally, we cannot be disconnected with the strategy for addressing that and the impact of that globally. So what we see here and what was announced in the report was this disconnect and this dissonance where action taken locally, which is quite laudable to address, to improve air quality, could actually be contributing to greater emissions and greater air pollution, and therefore greater health inequality somewhere else, right? So when we are thinking about global action, it's really critical that we have not just local policy coherence, but this global level coherence as well. So my last point is strategies to overcome these concerns. And I propose two things. So we were talking about transformative action. So I think the first really critical is integrated measurement. And this is an example. This is from the Global Climate and Health Alliance that's been publishing healthy nationally determined contribution scorecards, which look at the essentially the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions whilst achieving health co-benefits. They look at this out of a score of 15 across these 5 categories. And they found that, and you can see that on the right-hand side in the map, that so far of the NDCs that have been included in the report, all the NDCs above 10 points, so 10 out of 15, are in low and middle income countries. So if we're talking about equitable action, if we're talking about equitable impacts, it needs to be matched by equitable action, but what we're seeing actually is insufficient action where greenhouse gases are being produced most significantly. When we look at, by contrast, 4 out of 9 countries with a score of 0 are in high income countries. And interestingly, 7 of the 8 countries that aligned with the Paris Agreement are low middle countries, and those countries laid out there, and only the Gambia is aligned with the target of to fall under 1.5 degrees. One of the examples given in that scorecard is of the Cape Verde NDCs with a 2025 commitment to build a monitoring system for tracing climate change related risks and to build health and integrated integrated health and climate change resilience targets into national policies. So that's an example of integrated measures that we certainly need more of. And just a note, given my previous slide, that this relates to NDCs specifically for domestic action, and perhaps something that's missing from this scorecard so far the global actions, because we know that if we're talking about a planet, whilst domestic action is critical, countries need to be judged both by their domestic and their global action. And then the second transformative action in my last slide is integrated accountability. So integrated measurement and integrated accountability. And this is an example, just an example of that. So there's a huge opportunity for government to, particularly in the context of rethinking and rebuilding post-pandemic to think about doing so in a way that actually embraces health benefits as well as reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And in June 2020 June last year, the African Development Institute of the African Development Bank convened global experts for a policy seminar over 2 days to look at potential ways to rebuild and build inclusive health systems in post-COVID Africa. And I extracted very selectively things that I that I thought were really critical. Obviously covered the whole range of healthcare systems and systems for health, but things I thought were particularly interesting and important there were approaches to integrate health across urban policies, thinking about accountability critically. So these are some quotes from there. All ministers should have a planetary health portfolio. How do we think about making health everybody's business? And critically, how do we meaningfully engage youth as a key demographic whose health the development of the continent depends on? So this is just an one example of potential for integrated accountability at the policy level that has been advocated for. And so with that, I will end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tulula, for a wonderful talk, really integrating so many aspects, really, of determinants of human health within urban settings. And also, I think, demonstrating very compellingly why we can't afford to leave out cities when we're considering how to rapidly decarbonize and also create more resilient societies. And I think it's very appropriate we now pass on to our final speaker, Aramar Revi, because Aramar, I think, will bring a different perspective from his work as director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. He has really an unprecedented perspective on the potential for low carbon, more resilient development in the Indian context. And of course, India is such a pivotal country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable development agenda more generally. He's co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He led a successful global campaign for urban sustainable development, the Urban Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 11, part of the UN's 2030 Development Agenda. He's part of many other important international institutions like the UN Habitat Stakeholder Advisory Group, and he's a member of the Task Force on Global Health Diplomacy and Cooperation of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. He has really in-depth experience of IPCC, and he's a member, amongst other things, of the core writing team of the synthesis report, AR6 synthesis report that will be released in 2022. So although I'm sure he can't divulge many of the things we'd love to hear what's in the synthesis report, I'm sure he'll give us a very compelling presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I'll try and build on what our colleagues from the Pathfinders Initiative have sort of dealt with, but I'll try and focus a little bit more on the solution space. I mean, we know what the challenges are. Our real challenge at the moment is making our transition from the current mess that we're in, the so-called climate emergency that's going to become an emerging crisis, to a more healthy, equitable, and low carbon social system or societies across the world. And I think across the world is very important because the 2030 agenda really makes a commitment, which I think a lot of people still believe, of leaving no one, no place, and no ecosystem behind. So in that sense, it makes a commitment to both biosphere health and human health at the same time, which of course, as we know, is more difficult to do than to talk about. So I'll start with, and I won't talk about the synthesis report of the IPCC, but I'll start with the 1.5 report that I was part of co-leading, especially the chapter looking at how things can actually be done and scale up could happen. And I'll outline 2 or 3 things that I think are important. Of course, in the 1.5 report, we said that we were running out of time in dealing with the 1.5 overshoot. The recent Working Group 1 report puts a much clearer time frame on that. Effectively, we will see, we probably have anywhere, depending on what the metrics are, about a decade or so before we start experiencing overshoot. And I think this is quite important for us because if we're going to be seeing overshoot, part of the challenges that we'll have is that we don't really have a very clear idea of how the post-overshoot processes and development pathways will play themselves out. But from the modeling work, and we've heard a lot about that, what is relatively clear is that the only way to be able to contain overshoot over a long period of time, or significant overshoot well beyond 2 degrees and upwards, as the indices have set us on that trajectory too, the only way to really do that is by carbon dioxide removal. And I think carbon dioxide removal is something which may seem like an esoteric thing, but it has some very practical, significant implications on the ground, especially to agricultural systems, especially to systems that deal with ecosystems, and of course, because that has a cascade into national economies and to cities, as we heard just now, it will have an impact on human health more directly. So one of the core challenges that we have is that we do need to implement, the transition to, let's say, a 1.5 world as quickly as we can by dealing with 3 things simultaneously. We have to implement sustainable development, otherwise it's sort of politically and otherwise impossible to be able to carry forward. We also need to implement mitigation and adaptation simultaneously. Maybe 25 or 30 years ago, we could actually have looked at all of these processes independently and looked at the trade-offs among them. But I think the very clear message that we're getting from the science, from the IPCC work, is that we have to implement these things simultaneously, which means that we have to implement SDG 3 around health, along with dealing with SDG 13, SDG 11, we heard about cities just now, and a whole range of other questions around infrastructure, which touch pretty much the entire sort of gamut of sustainable development. Now, the challenge is, how does one actually do all of these 3 things simultaneously and execute them at the scale that we need to do, I guess, over the next decade, if not a little longer than that? I mean, effectively, if we're talking about a 2030 kind of endpoint to try and achieve the SDGs, we have probably just less than 3,000 days, and we have to implement this in at least 10 or 20,000 places across the world. So this is a huge implementation challenge, and I think we've outlined quite clearly in the 1.5 report that you need to implement 4 simultaneous system transitions together, to enable the integration between sustainable development, climate mitigation, and adaptation. The one that's actually going the quickest at the moment is what one would call the energy transition, especially the transition to renewables, and that has significant co-benefits as far as health is concerned, especially as we decarbonize systems that depend on, relatively dirty fuels like coal, and of course, even the transition to gas. So that's a renewables transition. The second one, which I'll speak a little bit about, especially in the context of India, is what we call the terrestrial and the ocean ecosystem transition, which is very critical because all of life, and especially cities, are absolutely critically dependent on ecosystems for food, fiber, and all the core ecosystem services that keep us alive. And frankly, as we proceed to higher temperature elevations, we don't actually know how to manage these systems very well, whether it's agricultural systems or managing the availability of water, which of course has a dramatic impact on health for water washed and waterborne diseases as far as that's concerned. So that was the energy transition, the environmental transition, which is focused on ecosystems, both terrestrial and oceans. And finally, a very critical transition, which is what we call the urban and the ecosystem transition, which Tolu just spoke about. Let me take you through a few examples of how this plays out on the ground in practice. Let me take the case of indoor air pollution, which of course is something that has a direct health impact, very well measured, and we understand it quite well. But in a country like India, where about 3/4 of the rural households even now use biomass or traditional biomass as fuel for cooking, and in spite of a massive effort to be able to bring forward the use of liquid LPG for cooking in urban areas, there's still about 20 to 25% of households that use biomass for cooking. Indoor air pollution, especially for the health of women, is a very significant concern. In fact, recent research shows that even in 2030, it's possible that in spite of the commitment to SDG 7.1, we will find almost 1 billion people who are extensively using biomass-based fuels in India. So not only does that have an impact in terms of indoor air pollution and all the other health-related direct health impacts, it also has an impact on carbon, black carbon commissions. About 25% of India's black carbon emissions come from this. So the question then is, how does one address this question? So, we are very focused at the moment in the discussion around COP26 on dealing with net zero and net zero targets. And of course, there's a big debate about peaking emissions. But, and I'll speak very frankly here, if we do not address fundamental questions like the transition to clean fuels, and this, as I said, could impact 500 million people, at least in South Asia, we're not going to get very far. It's pretty obvious why countries will push back around these questions unless we make the commitment. So even though we made this 100 billion commitment, which we know is probably a sixth of what we need to make the energy transition in terms of resource flows, the prioritization there, I guess, would be to address the challenges of the most vulnerable. And by addressing the challenges of the most vulnerable, you're not only dealing with questions of equity, but and justice, but you're also dealing with questions of health. And we know what the numbers are from what Andy's just shown us. So that's one clear thing, which is maybe not part of the mainstream discourse at the moment, but is absolutely critical. And this is true not only for South Asia, but also in other parts of Southern Africa. The second one, of course, again, a contrarian example, is around the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution has been very critical in South Asia in enabling food security and to some extent nutrition security. But it has had some dramatic adverse unintended consequences. I mean, the environmental ones are clearly known, but also, especially for India, the epidemic that we're seeing in terms of cardiovascular disease and dealing with diabetes is increasingly being linked to the use of wheat and rice instead of a much wider base of cereals, especially millets, which have been traditionally part of the Indian diet. So we're not talking here about questions of meat eating. Meat eating, of course, is a very critical question, but I picked a more narrow question here, and that is that if you really want to address questions of a transition to healthy diets, it's also a transition to crops that will survive at much higher temperature elevations and survive in environments in which land and water constraints are sort of favor, in a sense, some crops that have been traditionally part of diets in South Asia. So again, this seems to be slightly outside the mainstream discourse at the moment, but this transition, I think, is going to be quite important, will have a dramatic impact on hundreds or millions of people, and especially as we look forward and look at the deployment of carbon dioxide removal and the potential deployment of BECCS in a significant way, there will be serious trade-offs in terms of agricultural production, especially intensive agriculture. And with the growth of semi-arid areas and arid areas in parts of South Asia and many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the question of actually shifting into other crops becomes quite critical. And obviously it has significant impacts in terms of health. And finally, so in a sense, these two examples I've given you are examples where you're trying to bring together mitigation, adaptation with questions of development. They have direct impacts on development outcomes. And finally, in the urban context, the most obvious things, many urban areas across the world are well above 1.5 degrees, primarily because of the urban heat island effect. And of course, the way that urban areas are actually growing. Tolo spoke about that. We heard about that also from Lina. The challenge there is we have to look at the transformation and in terms of addressing heat stress in a holistic manner. Because the traditional, or let's say the conventional ways of dealing with this by deploying high energy cooling systems, moving to air conditioning, for example, is not only unsustainable in terms of the climate impacts, but also unsustainable in terms of the economic options that many people across the world, especially in sort of fuel scarce environments like South Asia and particularly India, are talking about. So we have to bring together a whole range of other instruments, and they're pretty well known. So greening of the environment, altering urban landscapes, being able to connect the city and the natural environment outside that, and of course changing the forms of building, whether it's trying to increase insulation at one end or using passive or low energy cooling systems that make things a little bit more obvious. So again, I've outlined these three different initiatives because they all have a dramatic impact on health, and as we see overshoots and extreme sort of climate events picking up over time, we will see both direct and indirect impacts of these processes in urban areas and in rural areas across South Asia. So I think the challenge for us is that the evidence, the scientific evidence of initiatives of this kind are actually few and far between. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but in the Pathfinders initiative, actually trying to bring together these evidences and sort of laying out concrete pathways between individual interventions that we've seen and we talked about and how they could be scaled up is going to be a significant challenge. So obviously there is much more opportunity for us to do work across the health and other sectors, do much more intensive interdisciplinary work in this space, both in first and second order impacts to try and be able to define what we now call climate resilient development pathways that can make this possible. So thank you very much. And I hope that we will get some interesting responses and questions to this.
Thanks so much, Amar, for another really wonderful talk and giving us, I think, many nuggets of very useful information and your thoughts about the way forward. Now, we do have time, some minutes for some questions and answers from the panelists. Let me invite those participating, the audience, to put their questions in the Q&A and obviously get some responses from our panelists. Any burning questions from our audience? Perhaps while we're waiting, have we got any at the moment? No, I don't think so. I'm not seeing it at the moment. While we're waiting, perhaps I could ask the panelists, given the proximity to COP26, if there's one thing that you'd like to see, and obviously there are many things we'd like to see coming out of it, but if there's any kind of cross-cutting issues that you'd really like to see coming out of COP26, it'll be useful to have your kind of insights and your responses. Lena, do you want to kick off about what your kind of hopes are for COP26 and what you would perhaps most like to see come out of it?
Well, I guess we are all holding our breaths right now to look at the scale up of ambition, because I do agree with Aromar that a lot of scientific assessments are giving us a decade or so to be able to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But more recent reports, which have possibly come out in the last few months, are already indicating that we have surpassed the limits that are available for human well-being and planetary well-being. So we are really with our backs to the wall, and I think that ambition is something that governments have to realize. You do see a lot of commitment with the net zero initiatives being called upon by several countries, but my fear is that in this whole push towards net zero, we are forgetting the differential capabilities and, of course, historical responsibilities for whatever that's worth. I mean, at least on the legitimate parts of it. And I think that issues of inequality are definitely not being considered in the range of actions that we are talking about. So these 2 or 3 things, if we can specifically focus on, I think that would be fantastic. I also believe that, since 2 of our speakers did speak about urbanization quite a bit, that we need to take a hard look at our urbanization patterns, given the enormous opportunity that has opened up from digitization and digitalization. I do not think we need to have the same kinds of urban magnets that we had in the past and the footprints that created of its own. So I think there are many things that can be done and done quickly. It's really up to us to ensure that we exploit those, harness those.
Thanks, Lena. And I realize I asked an impossible question, but I think you've given us a really kind of lucid answer. So let me then turn, and we only have a few minutes now, but let me just turn then to Tallulah and Aromar, maybe to focus on this issue of cities, because you both talked about it quite extensively. And we do see really quite a lot of activity at the city level. I mean, quite a lot of very active mayors, city leaders, city administrations, really working to try to protect their own communities, make them more resilient, but also in many cases also with ambitious climate actions projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in concluding, are there kind of any final optimistic thoughts you might be able to give those who are listening about how you see cities, and maybe give an example of a leader who is really doing something out of the ordinary that can really shift the frame of how we're thinking? So Tallulah, maybe to you, and then to Aramar for the final word.
Thanks, Andy, for pointing that out, because I think it's really critical that the narrative that includes the reality that lots of cities are actually doing a lot in this space. One of my observations is that part of the challenge is actually a mindset of impossibility related to disconnected action. So people are doing things in their cities at their level, and neighboring cities, neighboring countries are not connected and learning from each other in ways. So this is my experience from the African continent. And so when you get people who are a coalition of the willing together, who are kind of centered on climate resilience and health, what you find is a lot of repetition of the same mistakes in similar contexts. And this conversation goes a bit like this. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, we did that last year. We could have told you that wouldn't work. Oh, really? Or oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought, I've heard that happen elsewhere, but wouldn't have thought that was relevant for our context. But it's interesting you're doing that. Maybe we should. I can't tell you the number of times conversations have had that. So I think for me, the exciting spaces of getting this coalition of people, coalitions willing together, and actually equipping people with the tools, and also with the data. So a lot of cities say, great, we want to do this, but actually what should we be measuring? When you say health impact, what are the indicators and how do we measure it, given what is available? Not a project that comes in, does a survey and then goes off and you can't measure it again. How can we actually sustainably continue to measure the health impact? What do we need? So I think cities are looking for that kind of very concrete data support that is contextual to the context. And then I think the last thing that is exciting for me, surprise, surprise, is youth. I think it's the average person. If we talk about inclusion and equity, and we're not talking about youth, certainly in the African continent, then we're excluding the majority of people. And one of the exciting things for me is looking at the youth action in this space, particularly around climate. But I find the same patterns repeating. So youth are not connected. They're doing their own things. They're copying templates from elsewhere. They're trying different things out, and they're not as connected to each other and learning lessons from each other, and learning lessons from the evidence, right? So when we talk about, from a science perspective, when we talk about bringing that in, we should also not just be targeting policy, but also these youth advocacy and activist spaces, because we need that evidence-informed activism and advocacy as well.
Great. Thanks, Tallulah. So let me hand over to Aramar for the last word. We've only got a couple of minutes, unfortunately, but maybe you can take us out on a high note with a certain feeling of optimism, anyway.
So Andy, I think COVID has taught us that cities can do a lot. And I think at the cutting edge of COVID innovation have probably have less been national governments, but really local and regional governments. And that doesn't only mean people in cities, there are people outside in many parts of the world who are not necessarily in urban areas. And the reason for that is because at that scale, you can integrate across the multiple dimensions of sustainable development and climate action at the same time. That's what good mayors do. That's what good city leaders do. They deal with water and sanitation. They deal with health systems and delivery as far as that's concerned. They deal with inequality, and they deal with employment simultaneously. So at that scale, it's possible to do things. The challenge for us is that there's a very weak partnership between national governments and local and regional governments. In fact, most local and regional governments across the world are disempowered. They don't have the mandate to actually act in these spaces, including in health emergencies. They don't have the resources in terms of money and people. They have a lot of enthusiasm and the ability to get out and work and do things. So I think one of the critical things that we may want to see out of COP, apart from the net zero process, etc., is the operationalization or the localization of these processes and building of these partnerships. As we said, it's a partnership between 193 or 200 countries and 10,000 places that will actually deliver these outcomes on the ground. And the people who are going to do this, like Tolu was saying just now, are citizens, are young people who are sort of mobilized and ready to go out and do stuff, but they don't necessarily see the pathways by which the synergies that can deliver this these kind of processes can actually happen. We know, in a sense, what are the right things to do, whether it's making cities more healthy or changing diets or actually decarbonizing our energy systems and our economies. The question is how to make it happen. And I think there we hope that the Pathfinder Initiative will give us some fairly clear ideas and pathways to do that in the next few months.
Well, thanks so much, Aramal. Thank you to all our wonderful panelists. I think you'll all agree it's been a great session, very vibrant, very lively. Ending on a positive, optimistic note, there's a lot that can be done. And given the audience that's listening, I'd also like to say that health professionals have an important role in all this, working at the local and national level. We know that the health professional voice is amongst the most trusted in just about every country, doctors and nurses and so on. So I would also argue that health workers of various kinds have a really important role in advocating for a just and healthy transition, whether that be at the local or the national level. So we have to finish now. Thank you all very much for participating, for listening to us, and I hope you found a useful experience. And thanks again to all our wonderful panelists. Thank you. Bye,
Thank you, Andy. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.